Torah study is our national pastime and our national obsession. Our people, what we do is we study Torah. That's our identity. That's our culture. That's what makes us a nation. For us, the Torah is not just a system of laws, a code to live by, an ancient heritage, a glorious tradition. Torah is our essence. It is what identifies us as a people. And this has been true in the past. It's still very much true today. And it's even more true in Israel. There is a culture, a people who are dedicated. Their lives are about the study of Torah. And that, of course, ripples its way throughout society. And as we know, there's a big, perpetual, and strident debate in Israel. Should the yeshiva students get army deferrals? Should they have this idea where if someone's occupation, if their profession is Torah, maybe they should not have to serve in the army? That was instituted by Ben Gurion. It's still in effect, and it's a very animated debate today. But it's something to marvel that a very large segment of the population, they're willing to forfeit everything to study Torah. And that is just a modern example of a phenomenon that has been true as long as our people have existed, that the centrality of Torah study, it towers above all. We are told that even before Sinai, before we formally received the Torah, our forefathers, the architects of our people, they studied. The Talmud tells us that since the times of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there was never a moment where there was a cessation of Torah study. When Jacob fled from his brother and wanted to kill him, our sources tell us, he spent 14 years in the academy preparing for his encounter with Laban. After the nation has the Exodus, they spend 40 years in the wilderness. And what are they doing for 40 years? It is a continuous, ongoing academy of Torah study. And in fact, the Midrash tells us the reason why God did not take them directly out of Egypt into the Holy Land is because once they got there, they'd be busy living life, tending to their fields and planting their vineyards, and maybe not studying Torah enough. If you're going to have a nation, a Jewish nation, it must be grounded. It must be formalized based upon a very strong foundation of Torah study. And therefore, the Almighty made sure that the events would be such that they would spend 40 years in the wilderness and they would have all their needs tended to. They'd be cocooned in this special clouds of glory that would protect them from the elements. They'd eat manna that got parachuted to their door every day. And they'd have water emitted from a rock, and all their needs would be tended to so that they could study nonstop. And that's what they did. And only once that was firmly established into the psyche of the people, only then did they actually enter the land and begin to live lives as humans, but with that strong foundation. And again, we could go through this at great length, but the sources are clear that throughout our history, this was always the number one priority. The Talmud tells us quite memorably that when the Assyrians were threatening to destroy Judah, as they did to Israel, King Chizkiah, he sprung into action. And the Talmud gives us an image of what he did. He took a sword and went to the academy and says, whoever doesn't study Torah, I will slash them. That's one way to get people to study. He wanted to reinforce our people's connection with Torah. This is a matter of life and death. And they did a census from all parts of society. They crisscrossed the land, and they did not find any ignoramus. Not a man, not a woman, not a child who was not an expert in the most complicated and intricate laws of purity and impurity. And again, there are countless sources that we could choose from, but I want to give you a selection of teachings that just reinforce this idea that our nation is just obsessed with Torah study. Of course, the Mishnah tells us, we say it every morning, V'talmud Torah k'neged kulam. Of all the mitzvahs, there's one mitzvah that equals all of them. That's equivalent to all 613, and that is the study of Torah. If there is a city that does not perpetuate Torah, the Talmud tells us we must destroy it. And in fact, Jerusalem was only destroyed because there was a relative dip in Torah study. So much so, the Talmud tells us the imperative of Torah study is such that it's a greater mitzvah than saving a life. You save a life, it's like you save the whole world. But what's a greater mitzvah than that? The study of Torah. And this is featured in the law. You look at a book of law like the Rambam, and the Rambam, I will remind you, he is one who is considered to be more moderate, right? He's the one who had a real profession. He was a physician. And he encouraged us, or he cautioned us against taking the Torah, making it our source of livelihood. Don't make it a shovel to dig with. Nevertheless, for an average person, how much should someone study and how much should they work? Well, you have basically 12 hours of productivity a day. It's the right thing to do, maybe 3 hours of work and 9 hours of Torah study. And that's for the lay person. And that is featured in a book of law. What is the law? What is our religious code? What does it say? How does it instruct us and guide us in how we're supposed to allocate our time? 3 times to 1. At a ratio of 3 to 1, we should study Torah over working 9 hours versus 3 hours a day. There's a famous line from Sa'ad Yagon, Ein umonasenu umma. Our nation is only a nation, Ella b'toraso, only with its Torah. This is what embodies our people. This is what our life is all about. Tihem chayenu. This is our life, we say in the prayer. So it's a very well-established principle throughout our history, and even in our code, our law, that Torah is central and it towers above all. And of course, at the Torch Center in Houston, Texas, we're trying to continue this in all of our efforts. But I wanted to explore today a fascinating angle of what makes Torah so special. You know, Torah is different. It's utterly unique in so many different ways. But I want to tell a story of one element of the uniqueness of Torah, namely the infinity of Torah. Torah is effectively infinite. And I'm saying effectively because really only God is infinite, but because the Torah is almost a proxy for God. It's like God's mind. Just as God is infinite, we are told in the sources, so too the Torah is infinite. But unlike God, to understand the finite mind cannot grasp the infinite. We are precluded from understanding something which is infinite. Torah, well, that can be compatible with human sensibilities. And thus, our sages tell us that one of the best ways to understand God, to connect to Him, to love Him, is via the study of His Torah. And thus, we have a version of God, so to speak, a way to understand God that is compressed into frames of reference that make sense to us in this world. And that's why the study of Torah is so central if we want to understand God. And even when the Torah has been adapted to our sensibilities, even when it has been transposed, so to speak, to frames of reference that make sense to us as humans, even on this level, it is effectively infinite. So I want to explore this idea. What are some ways that we can appreciate Torah and appreciate just what it can do for us? So one way to understand the infinity of Torah is that, well, it existed before the world existed, before the notions of time and space, and God creating a vacuum, so to speak, in which the universe can be created. Even before that, before the rules of physics were set into place, before the limitations of this world were codified, before all of that, there was God and his Torah. And in fact, our sources tell us that not only was the Torah around before the world, it is the blueprint for the world. The Midrash tells us that when God considered, so to speak, to create the world, he consulted with the Torah. There's a famous line in the Zohar: God peered into the Torah, he gazed through the Torah and created the world. That is a way of saying that the Torah is a blueprint for the world, and thus everything that we find in the world, we can trace it back to the Torah. All the secrets of the universe are found in the Torah. The Torah is not subject to this world because it precedes it. In fact, the opposite is true. The whole world, all of creation, the universe, that is a reflection of Torah, that is subject to it. And one way that plays out is that we could find all the secrets in the world in the Torah. The Chavetz Chaim, in one of his amazing works called Shem Olam, he goes through different disciplines and where you would find in the Torah. Where would you find astronomy in the Torah, anatomy, engineering, mathematics, botany? It's all there because that's where it comes from. And then he cites an amazing midrash. He talks about one of the Roman philosophers. He was a scientist. And he wanted to do things properly. He wanted to do an experiment. And he was studying the gestation periods of various snakes. And he spent years trying to document the gestation periods of snakes. And then he met one of the great rabbis in Rome. And he says, you're so bright, you're so brilliant. Do you know the gestation periods of this and this snake? And the rabbi answered it effortlessly. He proved it from a verse in Scripture. He found the verse in Scripture. It says, there's the answer. And the Roman got so upset. He's like, I spent years in it, and this guy just plucked it out effortlessly. Now, again, because we know so little of Torah, it's hard for us to access those levels, but it's an important thing to ruminate upon. We have the privilege, the great opportunity to study the Almighty's Torah, and it's imperative upon us to try to delve into it as deeply as possible. But I want to explore what Torah actually is in reality, not just our relative understanding and immersion in it. So let's begin. The verse tells us about Torah, Arucha me'eretz mida. It is longer than the land. The measuring stick, the barometer of Torah, it exceeds the whole land. Urachava miniyam, and it's broader than the oceans. And the Midrash explains that the world, it has limits. There are boundaries. The Pacific Ocean is very large, but it still has a boundary. The heavens, they're quite vast. The galaxy, space, it's quite vast. And the Almighty kind of set borders to finite existence. Everything has a limit. Everything has a border. Everything has an endpoint. The Midrash tells us there's an exception. Heavens and earth, there is an endpoint. There's only one thing that is a creation, that is infinite, and that is the Torah. Quotes the verse, Arucha me'eretz mida urchava miniyam. It's broader than the land, it's deeper than the sea, it's more expansive than any finite creation. And I think this does highlight one of the differences that we have with Torah versus what Torah actually is. I've given this analogy a few times before. If someone wants to walk into the Pacific Ocean, you can actually do it. You could walk into the ocean and you could, walk just a few feet and the water's up to your ankles. And if you were to kind of freeze yourself in that moment, you're like, I could be in a puddle. I can be in a small swimming pool for toddlers. But the deeper you go in, it gets to your knees and then to your thighs, and before you know it's way over your head. The deeper that you go in, the deeper you realize that it actually is. And then if you go to the depths, the actual depths of the ocean, it's just unfathomably deep, thousands and thousands of feet. So there's that same duality in Torah that the novices who only have their little toe in it, they may think that, I can summarize all of Torah. I understand it. But the more someone immerses themselves in it, the deeper they go, the more they appreciate how marvelous it is. And thus, our relative understanding of the depth of Torah will increase the more we know. And that's why we're encouraged to try to engage in Torah as much as possible. If you understand something on a basic level and you turn it over, the Mishnah tells us, you could see it from a different angle and a different dimension and a different facet. And you'll never cease to see new angles and new insights. The only limiting factor is your immersion, your exposure. And thus, the more you know, the more you realize how ignorant you are, because the vaster of an appreciation of Torah you actually discover. So let's begin to try to map out the infinity of Torah. The prophet describes Torah like fire. The words of God are like fire. And like a hammer that shatters a stone. The Talmud explains that if you were to take a hammer and shatter a stone, shards will fly in every direction. And that is an apt metaphor for Torah. Because you have one verse, one word, one stone, and you begin to pound at it, to study it, and you see shards in every direction. You see manifold layers and interpretations and insights and ways of understanding. As you engage with Torah, you have to, of course, do your effort. You have to take that hammer and bang at it. But once you engage, you'll see more and more dimensions. The Talmud reveals to us that there are 50 levels of insight. And there are Shivim Panim La Torah, 70 facets of Torah. And Moshe, he's the absolute peak of it all. He understood almost everything. And regarding him, the verse in Psalms says, this is Psalms chapter 8, verse 6, V'techasreu me'at me'elokim. Moshe is a little bit less than God, one notch below, so to speak. Well, if there are 50 levels of insight and 70 facets of Torah, you add those two together, 50 plus 70, that's 120. And the verse says, "V'tachsher me'at me'elokim," that Moshe is one notch less than God. What's the gematria of the word me'at? Mem is 40, ayin is 70, and a tet, or a tes, is 9. So 40 plus 70 plus 9 is 119. Moshe is like 119 of 20. He's a little notch below full, complete understanding of the infinite. But it goes further. We know that there are 600,000 root souls. And the commentaries tell us that there are 70 facets of Torah, but there's a different one for every root soul. Moreover, there are 4 dimensions of Torah. There's the Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. And on each one of these dimensions, there are 70 facets times 600,000 root souls. So if we're to take one idea in Torah, one word in Torah, one sentence in Torah, and we want to understand the totality based upon this idea of how many interpretations, how many elements, how many different dimensions are present in every part of Torah, it's more than 100 million, because each person has their 70 times the 4 different realms. And then there are 600,000 of these packages of 280. And the commentaries go further and say, well, if someone has more than 70 interpretations of one verse in Torah, how could they have more than 70 interpretations? Well, maybe you'll say that every person is supposed to have 280 because there's 4 different realms times 70 apiece in each realm. But what if someone has 500 interpretations in a single verse? That is only possible if they have encroached upon one of their co-religionists' packages of Torah. You could take from your friends. If you match out your 280, you're maybe able to access levels of Torah that are really apportioned to others. So we're starting to see a little bit of a picture how the Torah in its absolute reality, it's just enormously vast and vaster than we can possibly fathom. And the commentators explain that the vessel in the tabernacle and the temple that symbolizes Torah, that vessel is, of course, the ark. The ark in which the tablets, both the ones that were shattered and the ones that were ultimately not shattered, first and second tablets, that was in the ark. And the crown around the ark, well, that symbolizes the crown of Torah. And the commentaries note, if you look at the dimensions of the ark, it's 2.5 by 1.5 by 1.5. Why is it all halves? That's to symbolize, the commentaries tell us, that with regards to Torah, no matter how much you know, no matter how vast your relative prowess of Torah, it's only half. You know more, it's still only half. There's always so much more that you don't know. So let's go a bit further. We have God, God's infinite. And kind of so is his Torah. And if we're fortunate enough to study a little bit of it, we're only scratching the surface. We're only seeing a tiny, tiny microscopic sliver of what Torah actually is. And the deeper we go, and the more we study, the vaster we discover that it actually is. On a very basic level, we have the Babylonian Talmud. And today you could read it in perfect English. You don't have to study the ancient language of Aramaic. You could read it in English. And it is so vast. Today, the most common version of it, the Art Scroll translation, it's 73 volumes. But even that, you got to read it very slowly and carefully to even understand it on the most basic level. But even the Talmud, that's a little more than half. It only covers a little more than half of the Mishnah. There's only 36 or 39, depends how you count, of the books of the Mishnah that are covered in the Talmud. If someone were to finish the Mishnah, that's an enormous accomplishment. If someone finishes the Talmud just once, forget about knowing it. That's an accomplishment of a lifetime. Well, and then you have the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. If you're a real scholar, you got to know them both. So just, excuse me. So just to get started, the bookshelf is very large. Now, I've had the great privilege of meeting people that know a ton of Torah. People who spend their whole lives studying and mastering Torah. I used to have the privilege of studying in a study hall that had one of the great sages of Jerusalem who had studied there. His name is Rabbi Chaim Uri Freund. And you can ask him any question in all of Torah and all of Talmud everywhere. I remember once I asked him a question about a book of Talmud that I was studying, and he cited for me the commentary of Rashi verbatim. Like I'm studying this, he's studying what it doesn't. He's not studying that, and he recites to me the commentary of Rashi verbatim, and then he smiled and he's like, "You know when I studied this last? It was 35 years ago." That's when he studied it last. Just an example of the levels of scholarship that are existing today. Now, the shining star of our generation was the great Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. And every year, he would finish all of Torah. What does that mean? Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, Mishnah, all the Midrash, all the Zohar, all the Shulchan Aruch and Rambam, everything, every single year. And he knew it. And his father-in-law, the great Rabbi Yaakov, people would just marvel how he knew everything. And it was all clear. They used to say if the temple was rebuilt and suddenly, in an instant, all the laws of purity and impurity that are so intricate and complex, and they all went into effect right away, there'll be one person who knows exactly what we need to do in every conceivable situation. It was as clear as day for him. One of the other great sages of the generation wrote a book on some of the laws of purity and impurity. And he spent decades on it. And he's like, I want to go visit Rabbi Elyashiv. I want to speak to him about this subject that I spent decades researching and writing this incredible book upon. And he goes to Rabbi Elyashiv, and he leaves, he emerges deflated. The man knew it better than I know it, even though I spent decades studying it. These are the kinds of geniuses and people with incredible Torah mastery that existed in our lifetime, people that I saw. None of them would compare themselves to the great sages who lived 70, 80 years ago, like the Chazon Ish. They would all say Chazon Ish was a class above us. And if you were to ask the Chazon Ish, how do you compare to the great Gaon of Vilna? He would say, I'm like a student compared to him. The Gaon of Vilna lived in the 18th century, 1720 to 1797. And he had, on one verse in the book of Numbers, 2,260 interpretations on a single verse. He knew all of it, everything, by heart, frontways and backwards. You know, you see the people that they get arrested and they have to say the ABC backwards. You've seen that before? All of Torah, all of Talmud, all of Rambam, all of everything, frontwards, backwards. How many times does the letter Gimel appear in the Torah? It's just total mastery over everything. Everything, front, back, front and center. At the end of his life, he would study the written Torah exclusively, because he would say that if you know all of oral Torah completely, you'll find that all the secrets and all the levels and all the dimensions are actually found in the written Torah. And there's a perfect match between the two. It's just they're written on completely different dimensions. There's a story about the Gaon of Vilna. Someone came to him and said, it was on the festival of Sukkot. He said, I know the book of Talmud of Sukkah. I studied it well. He's like, oh, can I test you? He said, sure, test me. He says, how many times is there a dispute between Abaya and Rava in this book of Talmud? How many times is the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir? Between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? How many times does Rashi and Tosfos disagree in the whole book? And the Gaon of Vilna began to recite every dispute between every group of sages, every two sparring mate sages in the whole book. And then he said, well, how many times are there examples where the Talmud says that there's a kosher sukkah? And how many times is there an example where the Talmud says that there's a non-kosher sukkah? And began to list, there's 85 instances where the Talmud says that there's a non-kosher sukkah, a certain case of a sukkah. It's a non-kosher sukkah, and there's 91 different cases in the book where the Talmud tells us that there's a kosher sukkah. Just absolute, total, magnificent mastery of all of Torah. And it's all traced back to the oral Torah, the written Torah, and it's perfectly in sync with each other. You have 5 or 6 verses in the book of Devarim in the written Torah, and they correspond to the books of Talmud of Kiddushin and Gittin, which you can legitimately spend years studying, and you can read the verses in Scripture in, 20 seconds. And then you read the books of Talmud, and it's a perfect parallel, and it could take you 5 years. If you read it with all the commentaries, with all the explanations, with all the laws. And again, that's only on the pshat level, only on the simple level. The dimensions, forget about it. Someone once told the primary student of the Gaon of Vilna, his name was Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. He said, well, your brother, Rabbi Zalman of Volozhin, he knows all of Torah down to the letters. He's sort of similar to the Gaon of Vilna, to the teacher. And he said, no, you have it totally wrong. You have it totally wrong. If my brother lived for 1,000 years and studied with the incredible diligence that he's studying with, he wouldn't reach the ankles of the Gaon of Vilna. And again, the Gaon of Vilna lived in the 18th century. And then they asked Reb Chaim of Volozhin, how great was the Gaon of Vilna in a historical context? Was he as great as the authors of the Mishnah and the Talmud? And he said, absolutely not. He was only on the level, on par with the Rishonim, with the medieval sages, those sages from the medieval era, like maybe the Ramban or the Rashba, but not like Rashi, not like the Rambam. This is the Gaon of Vilna, incomparable genius, someone who's really from a different era, but he's only akin to the Rashba or the Ramban, not to Rambam and Rashi. I go back a few generations earlier. As we go back, we find levels of Torah that are so vastly greater than the succeeding generations. In the 1580s, the Megala Amukras was born. Rab Nassan Nata Shapira, or Spira. And we have a book from him. It's a thick book. I have a copy of it in my house. And it's not on the whole Torah. It's not like a commentary on the whole Torah. It's a commentary on a few verses in the Torah. Specifically, when Moshe is detailing his dialogue between him and God, where God says, you can't go into the land, and Moshe says, I want to go into the land. And God says, no, you can see it, but you can't go into it. That little dialogue, what were they discussing? What were the variables? What were the issues at hand between Moshe and God? So this book is 252 interpretations in this dialogue. And again, I own a copy of the book. And each one of them is an absolute masterpiece of how he connects a different dimension of Torah into this debate, into this dialogue between Moshe and God. He effectively weaves all of Torah into this little, citation in Devarim, this debate between Hashem and Moshe. If you were to look in a Torah scroll, on the very first word of the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus, you'll notice that the font size of the first 4 letters of the word Vayikra is 5 letters: a Vav, a Yud, a Kuf, a Resh, and an Aleph. The first 4 letters are the same uniform size, but the Aleph is small. There's an Aleph Ze'ira, a small Aleph. Why is there a small Aleph? The last letter of this word, Vayikra. So if you were to ask you and I, we don't know. We're so ignorant. We have no idea. Why is there a small Aleph? I don't know. That's the instruction. The Megala Amukros wrote a book where he offered Aleph interpretations into the small Aleph. Now, what does Aleph interpretation mean? The word Aleph means to learn, but also means 1,000. Aleph is 1,000. He wrote a book with 1,000 interpretations as to why there's a small Aleph on the last letter of the word Vayikra. 1,000 different interpretations. Again, this is just to give us a sense of what we're talking about. We're talking about the vast levels of Torah that are effectively infinite. We have someone who lived, 400 or so years ago, and he had a much vaster understanding of Torah, and we have a book, 1,000 interpretations on the small Aleph of the word Vayikra. You go back a generation, you have the Arizal. These secrets that the Arizal revealed are vastly outnumbered by the secrets that he concealed. And again, the Arizal, he didn't make it to 40. He wasn't 40 years old before he passed. And the amount of bookcases that we could fill with the writings of the Arizal to fill a whole library. Once his primary student, Rabbi Chaim Vital, he was leaning over him while he was sleeping because the great rabbi was murmuring in his sleep. He's trying to listen in. What's he saying? What kind of secrets of Torah is he revealing? Every night he would ascend to a different academy in heaven. So when the great rabbi wakes up, he says, "Tell me what they taught you in heaven." He said, if I spoke to you for 80 years nonstop, I couldn't reveal to you all the secrets that was just revealed now in heaven. Again, to us, it's so completely incomprehensible. But these people that lived, 500 years ago, and the access of Torah relative to us, it's just a complete different universe. You go back to the Rishonim, to the sages of the medieval era, and you look at the writings of the Rambam. My grandfather used to always say that if the Gentiles had a personality like Rambam, they would have immediately deified him. Because you cannot fathom one person doing so much. Rambam writes a work called Mishnah Torah, where he synthesizes all of oral Torah into a single work, 14 books, organized by topic. You have the laws of Shabbos, right? Where do you find the laws of Shabbos? In every single book of Talmud, you find laws of Shabbos. And in the Talmud, you find it in a very difficult to reach a conclusion style because it's very much a dialogue. And the Talmud does not give us, or often does not give us, the bottom line. So Rambam takes all of oral Torah, which is the Mishnah and both Talmuds and all the other associated literature, like the Mechilta, Sifra, Sifri, Torah's Kohanim, etc. And he's able to withdraw from it all the laws of Shabbos and to organize it by topic and give us the conclusions. It's a work that if we wanted to replicate it, we'd need teams of 10,000 scholars working for 100 years. And one man did it. One man did it while working as a physician. That was his day job. The Gentiles, they have someone like that, they would right away deify him. My grandfather used to say. But if you were to compare the Rambam to the generation that came after the writing of the Talmud, incomparable. They're on such a higher level, we cannot even equate the two. In the words of the Talmud, if the earlier ones, they're like angels, we're like humans. And if they're like humans, we're like donkeys. You can compare the earlier generations to the later generations. The closer you are to Sinai, the closer you are to this revelation of God in the world, the deeper your insight, the broader your soul, and the more profound your understanding of Torah is going to be. If you were to go back a generation earlier to the Amoraim, the authors of the Talmud, they were absolute giants. And the aforementioned Chafetz Chaim tells us that even within the era of the Talmud, the earlier sages were that much greater than the later sages. The Talmud tells us that Rav Asi was one of the sages of the Talmud. He fasted for 300 days, ate at night, because he wanted to have a revelation where one of the sages of the Talmud of a previous era, a previous generation, would reveal himself to him. So one of the sages of the Talmud, for another sage of the Talmud, he wanted to have a revelation, wanted to have a dream where the departed sage would appear to him. And the Talmud reveals that when he actually did appear after 300 fast days, he was so taken by this persona, by the stature of this great sage, that he was shaking violently from the appearance of this great sage. And the Talmud concludes and says, don't think that the reason why Rav Asi was shaking so much because of the appearance of Rav Chia. Don't think that that's because Rav Asi was so small. Oh no. It tells another story, that there was someone who had a dream how the heavens were about to fall. But there was one person that was holding up the heavens from destroying the world. And this person came to Rabbi Yochanan, and he tells him what he saw. And he says, one of your students, he has the merit to perpetuate the whole world. So Rabbi Yochanan says, well, would you recognize him? And he says, yeah. So he lines up all his students like a police lineup. And he says, that's him. He points to Rav Asi. Someone who's such a sage, who knows so much Torah, whose connection with Torah is so strong, whose righteousness is so elevated, that he's the reason why the world perpetuates. Him, compared to an earlier sage, he would shake violently at the mere sight of that sage. And these are the authors of the Talmud. You'll find, if you ever have the great privilege of reading the Talmud, that the authors of the Talmud would never argue with the authors of the Mishnah. They themselves, they recognized that compared to the authors of the Mishnah of the previous generations, they were not on par with them. Regarding the authors of the Mishnah, the Talmud quips that the most junior of them was so righteous and so elevated and knew so much Torah, was so connected to Hashem via his Torah. The most junior of the sages of the Mishnah were able to resurrect the dead. And if we go through the generations of the Mishnah, we see again how every preceding generation was so much greater than the generation that came subsequently. So you have, of course, Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, he's the primary author of the Mishnah. Why? Because Stam Mishnah Rabbi Meir, every unattributed Mishnah, it's actually his. And the Talmud tells us that the rulings do not follow Rabbi Meir. If Rabbi Meir has a disagreement with one of his colleagues, with one of his contemporaries, the ruling does not automatically follow Rabbi Meir. Why not? So the Talmud tells us, we know very well that in the generation of Rabbi Meir, he was peerless. He was incomparable. So why is the halacha not like him? Because his knowledge and his grasp of Torah was so legendary that he was able to do things that his colleagues, his contemporaries, could not wrap their heads around. He could prove that what is impure is pure and bring evidence that's incontrovertible. And he could prove that what is pure is impure. And his evidence is airtight. And thus, because he was so much head and shoulders above his peers, they couldn't grasp what he was saying, and therefore they did not rule like Rabbi Meir. Now, Rabbi Meir, his teacher was Rabbi Akiva. That's a generation earlier. Regarding Rabbi Akiva, the Talmud tells us that when Moshe ascended to heaven to get the Torah, he saw God making little crownlets above the letters. Why are you making crownlets above letters? Is it not sufficient to just give us the letters, not the crowns above it? So God tells Moshe, I'm only doing it because there's going to be a sage who's going to understand not just the letters, but the crowns, and will derive and deduce piles and piles of laws from every jot and tittle. Every little crownlet above the letter, Rabbi Akiva will have access to that levels of Torah, and therefore that's what I'm doing it for, God tells Moshe. That's the teacher of Rabbi Meir. Now, if you were to ask Rabbi Akiva, he's someone who's really, really deep in the ocean of Torah. You were to ask him, well, how much of Torah do you actually know? Your knowledge compared to the absolute Torah. Well, we don't need to speculate what Rabbi Akiva would say. We know. The Talmud documents a conversation that Rabbi Akiva had with a contemporary, where this contemporary tells Rabbi Akiva, you're great, and your name resonates from one end of the world to the other. But you are no greater than a shepherd of livestock. And that sounds like an insult. But what this great sage was telling Rabbi Akiva, you have so much Torah. You're the greatest sage of the generation. But your knowledge compared to what Torah actually is, so to speak, the infinity of Torah, you're no better than a shepherd of livestock. Because the Torah itself is infinite, and you know a lot in relative terms, but in absolute terms, you know nothing. You're like a shepherd of livestock. And Rabbi Akiva responds, no, you have it wrong. I'm not like a shepherd of livestock. I'm like a shepherd of small animals, small sheep. And to us, this sounds like Rabbi Akiva has humility, where he's saying, oh, I'm so little, I'm so insignificant. But what he's actually revealing to us is that Rabbi Akiva was a greater sage than this person. And thus Rabbi Akiva knew more about what he didn't know. And thus his relative understanding, compared to what Torah actually is from his perspective, he knew even less, because he knew how much more Torah there was. The greater you are, the greater you recognize that Torah actually is. Now, Rabbi Akiva also had a teacher. Well, who was his teacher? I teach in the all-girls high school here in Houston, and I'm doing a lot of these types of studies. We're doing right now we're doing the introduction of Rambam to his work, where he traces the history of oral Torah. And he goes through the 40 generations from Moshe until the writing of the Talmud by Rav Ashi and his son. And we're reading all these names, and a lot of the girls are kind of rolling their eyes. Why is it so important for us to know this? Well, this is our people. This is our history. This is who we are. And I actually have a test I'm giving tomorrow, and the extra credit question. List in order the 40 generations from Moshe until the writing of the Talmud. I want you to know all these names. It's important to know all these names. So we know Rabbi Meir, his teacher was Rabbi Akiva. Who was Rabbi Akiva's teacher? I actually have a line chambered. I'm just waiting for one of the girls to say, why do we need to know this? Why is this important? They don't know that I'm ready for that. My plan is to tell them, do you know who Taylor Swift's boyfriend is? Okay, if you can know that, you can know who the great sages of our people are. That's the line I have chambered for them. Hit them on the head with a club. We'll see if they fall into my trap. Who was Rabbi Akiva's teacher? Well, he had a few teachers, but the primary teacher was Rabbi Eliezer. And the Talmud records what happened with Rabbi Eliezer on his deathbed. He lifted his two arms and he placed them upon his heart. And he said to his students who were visiting, woe to you, because my two arms, my two forearms, they're like two Torah scrolls that are being rolled up. You're going to lose your capacity to ask me questions. You're going to lose your capacity to have an insight into my Torah because I'm passing. And then he started speaking about his Torah versus his teacher's Torah. I studied a lot of Torah and I taught a lot of Torah. I studied so much Torah, but compared to what my teachers knew, I was like a dog that drinks from the sea. You know, how much water does a dog pull out of the sea? Yeah, a minuscule amount. That's what I pulled out of my teacher's vast seas of Torah. And I taught a lot of Torah, but my students, they kind of only learned 1% of what I taught them. And they knew, they pulled out of me, so to speak. They extracted from me, just like an applicator. If you take a little Q-tip and you put it into, a little bit of dye or formula or something like that, how much you pull out? Just a small amount. And he starts talking about what he knows, and no one asked him questions. He's lamenting the fact that so much Torah is about to depart from the world. I taught 300 different laws in this obscure area of the laws of Tsaras. And no one asked me a single question. All those laws are going to disappear with me. And I know 3,000 or 300 different elements of the laws regarding this very arcane and esoteric element of the laws of sorcery. And there's no one who asked me about it besides for one student. And he recounts how Rabbi Akiva asked his teacher about some very, very obscure and esoteric element of the laws of sorcery. So again, we see Rabbi Meir, he's towering above his peers, but he's nothing compared to his teacher, Rabbi Akiva, who's nothing compared to his teacher, Rabbi Eliezer. Well, who was his teacher? Who was the teacher that he says about himself that I lapped up like a dog laps up from the sea? I know so little compared to my teachers. That is the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. This is all on the test, by the way. All of this is on the test. Well, what do you know about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? The Talmud tells us there was nothing that he didn't know. And it lists his attributes. The Talmud, the book of Sukkah, page 28a. He never in his life had any idle chit-chat. It was always Torah. And he never walked 4 cubits without being bedecked in tefillin and studying Torah. And no one ever got the academy before he did. And he never slept in the academy. He was there all the time, but never slept in there. And he was so connected to Torah, but he never studied Torah in a place that was unfit for Torah study. He never left the academy when there was someone else there. He was always the last to leave. And whenever he walked in, he honored people to such a degree that he never allowed someone to open the door for him. He always opened the door for other people. I never taught something he didn't learn from his teachers. And he never said it's time to leave the academy, only twice a year. Day before Pesach, day before Yom Kippur. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was a student of Hillel. And the Talmud tells us Hillel had about 80 primary students. And 30 of them, they were worthy to have the divine presence rest upon them like it did upon Moshe. And 30 of them, they were worthy of having the sun freeze itself in the sky like it did for Joshua. And there are 20 average ones. And this great sage, Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, the teacher of Rabbi Eliezer, the teacher of Rabbi NETIV, the teacher of Rabbi Meir, this Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai that Rabbi Eliezer said about him, I lapped up from him like a dog lapping up from the sea. He was the most minor of the 80 students of Hillel. And if this sage, who's so minor, yet he's so incredible, well, what do we know about the one who is even greater than him? And the Talmud lists all the incredible accomplishments of Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, but what about his colleague, who was the greatest of the 80 sages? That's Yonasan ben Uziel. And when he would study Torah, any bird that flew above him would just incinerate itself. It would just be, the angel was dancing around him while he was studying, and any bird that went into his airspace would just die. Because when he studied, it was a recreation of Sinai. And it was just a place where it was not safe for birds. Well, Rabbi Meir's teaches Rabbi Akiva's teaches Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi's teaches Rabbi Zakkai, Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai's teacher is Hillel. What do we know about Hillel? How did Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai compare his knowledge to the knowledge of his teacher? He tells us, if all the heavens were parchments, and all the trees were quills, and all the oceans were dye, if I had just effectively limitless ability to transcribe, I cannot write enough about what I studied from my teacher, from Hillel. But compared to what he actually knew, this is what he says. It's like a fly that wants to immerse itself into the Mediterranean Sea. And it comes out and there's a little drop in it, a tiny little drop of it. That's what I pulled out from what Hillel actually knew. What I pulled out is a lot. Again, all the heavens are parchments and all the trees are quills and all the oceans are dye. That's what I pulled out. But compared to what he actually knew, it's like a little, the trip to the beach of the fly. What does it pull out of the water? Nothing. And then it talks about Hillel's mastery. He knew everything in every language, and he knew the secrets of the conversations of the mountains and of the valleys. And he knew the secrets behind the conversations of the trees and the grasses and the animals and the undomesticated animals and the demons and all the parables. Again, this is totally unfathomable levels of Torah. But Hillel, he's one of the authors of the Mishnah. He's not even on the level of a prophet, even the most junior of prophets. He's nothing compared to Ezra and the end of prophecy, the men of the Great Assembly. And that's the lowest level of prophets. So Jeremiah is not as great as Jonah, and he's not as great as Elisha, and Elisha's not as great as Elijah. And Elijah, of course, well, he's not as great as King David, who's one of the 48 prophets. What did King David know? What was his association with Torah? What levels of the infinite did he grasp? Well, the Midrash tells us that when he fled from Saul, in one night, as he's fleeing from Saul, he would study what a veteran student needs 100 years to study. So David's way greater than all the other prophets that came after him, who are way greater than Hillel and Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai and Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir. What did he say about himself? How did he pray? He prayed, Galei nai, uncover my eyes and let me see the wonders of your Torah. David is saying, I'm ignorant to matters of Torah. Yes, I know a lot, but compared to Torah, I don't know. I know nothing. And he's praying, please show me a little bit of Torah. Similarly, David says in Psalms, I am a convert. I'm a convert in the land. And don't conceal from me your mitzvos, your commandments. Says the Midrash, wait a minute, is David a convert? He's not a convert. He's the son of Jesse. He's from the tribe of Judah. What David is telling us that he's like a convert. Convert comes with nothing, doesn't know any Torah. That's what David says about himself. How could David say that? He towers above all the prophets that came subsequently, and certainly all the authors of the Mishnah, because he knew way more. And thus, he knew how little he knew. And he felt like, I just know nothing. I'm way closer to the convert, can't even read Hebrew, nothing, than what Torah actually is. But of course, there's Moshe. Now, Moshe, he knew everything, right? Now, we know that there's a lot of levels of Torah that Moshe had that we no longer have access to. For example, the Talmud tells us that we have 6 orders of Mishnah. Moshe had 600 orders of Mishnah. So there were 100 times more Mishnahs that Moshe had than what we have. It's all lost since then. The book of Avodah Zarah that Abraham had, the Talmud tells us, it had not 5 chapters like our book of Avodah Zarah has. It had 400 chapters. It was 80 times larger. So Moshe's Torah, right? Like this is the beginning of it. God gave him everything, right? Moshe knew God like no one else did. God testifies about Moshe. He's an unparalleled prophet. He knew God face to face. What does he say? What does Moshe say? Ata hachilosa. You started to show to your servant your greatness. Moshe knew everything. Compared to us, he knew everything. He's telling God, I just got the very beginning. I'm like in the introduction. You started to reveal your Torah, your essence to your servant. When we trace the infinity of the Torah, we can know a lot, but we know nothing compared to just the generation past, certainly centuries past, and going back all the way to Moshe. And Moshe himself says, I just got the very beginning. We just got started. You started. Show me more. This opens us up maybe a little bit of a picture of what we mean when we say the Torah is infinite. I think a good way of illustrating this is that the Talmud compares the difference between this world and Olam Haba, the world to come. It's similar to the world inside a uterus versus the world outside of a uterus. If you were to ask a baby in utero, right? Well, how big is the world? Well, it's pretty big. I can stretch, I can move, I have all my needs taken care of. It's a whole universe inside there. And you were to tell this baby, imagine something so much vaster. Vast lands and countries and continents, enormous oceans, but that's just in this world. Then there's the atmosphere and the space and the planets and the solar system and the galaxies and there's billions of light years. Like you're in this little cramped little pouch, this little cocoon. Yeah, it's nice and it's big, but compared to this world, it's like nothing. It's like a tiny, tiny speck of nothing. That difference between this world, between the world of the embryo to the world of our world, that's the same difference as our world to the world to come. We're effectively in this small little pouch. Yeah, it's so big and so vast, but compared to what the world actually, that other world, it's nothing. The difference that the baby has between his world and our world, that matches the difference between our world and the world to come. the spiritual world. Torah is really on that level. Moshe goes up to heaven. What's he doing? Where's he going to? He's going to the other dimension, to the world to come, where he's around angels, and he's getting the Torah from there. And yes, he brings it down to our level, and he is able to transpose, really, God's able to transpose that to ways that we understand, but the soul of Torah, the roots of Torah are still in that universe. When we think of our world, it's not infinite, but it's effectively infinite. And that's nothing, that's tiny compared to the actual world from which the Torah originates. I think it's a very important thing for us to reinforce. We have the great privilege of studying Torah. And there's a way for us to understand it on whatever level we are at. It's important for us to always keep in mind there are secrets upon secrets upon secrets, universes of secrets on every letter, on every word, on every crownlet. Rambam, in his 13 Principles of Faith, tells us, in principle number 8, when he talks about the divinity of Torah, part of the divinity of Torah, he tells us, is to understand and recognize that there are wonders and secrets and wisdoms in every single word of Torah. And no sage can actually access and understand the endpoint of this infinity of Torah. And what we have to do is follow the example of David. David prayed, we should pray. Uncover our eyes, reveal to us. Let me witness, let me see the wonders of your Torah. And of course, this is very overwhelming for us, because we're so ignorant. And it could be a little bit depressing. Moshe knew everything. He just got started. So what chance do we have? The nice thing about it is that on whatever level a person's at, there's a portal, there's an entry point to Torah. And once we begin studying, the effect is exponential. Torah study is not linear. If it takes you a year to study one book of Talmud, the second book will take you a half a year. And the third book, a couple of months. And the fourth book, maybe in a month, and so on. And as you round out your knowledge of Torah, and you see all the connections again on your level, it's reinforcing. So what you do in 1 year, you can't just map that out over 70, 80 years. That it grows exponentially. But I think it's important for us to always keep in mind that no matter how much we know, and hopefully we should know more and more and more and more, compared to what Torah actually is, we know effectively nothing. We're lapping out a little bit. We're the fly that's being dropped into the Pacific Ocean. Well, what do you pick up out of it? Just a tiny drop. But as we expand our knowledge of Torah, as we immerse in it more and more, as we get a bigger conception of what Torah actually is, as we delve deeper and deeper into it, we'll begin to appreciate it more and more. And I think on our level, it's important for us to constantly be reviewing. Every time we go into the Torah, every time we begin Genesis 1:1 again, we're going to see it on a different level, on a different dimension, with a different understanding, and be able to glean new insights into it. My grandfather, blessed memory, observed to his students that he found at the end of his life, the parts of Torah that still fascinate him are the same parts of Torah that fascinated him when he was a teenager. How is that? You studied it, right? You know it. You move on to other things. If you're really connected to Torah and you're really interested in immersing yourself in the Almighty's wisdom, you can study it deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. So it's the same entry point, it's the same touch point of Torah, but you could start scaling lower and lower into the depths and the different dimensions and different layers and facets and insights. We have an opportunity. We're here for a limited amount of time. And our deepest desire is to connect to Hashem. And the best way to do that is through his Torah. And hopefully today we got a little tiny inkling into the awesomeness of Torah. And of course, by that, we can extend a bit of an appreciation of the unfathomable greatness of the Torah's creator, of God. And I think it's helpful to compare other disciplines to Torah. It's just, they're all a joke in comparison. And not only that, all of them could be traced back to Torah on their own. So you wonder why people are obsessed with it, why it's part of the culture, why it is the culture, not part of the culture, it's the culture, it's the essence of the nation, why people are so madly in love with it. Why are they so obsessed with it? Can't you just study for a couple of years and get your degree and move on? It's not like that. And those who are fortunate enough to actually spend hours and hours a day, 10, 12 hours a day to actually study it, they see something we don't see. They have a vantage point of Torah that it's just totally beyond us. So yeah, we could, as outsiders, we could ask the questions, well, why are there so many Shiva students? Why are they so obsessed with it? Why do they want to dedicate their whole lives to it? Why do they want to forfeit everything in our world? They're in a much different world, a much vaster world. They have a appreciation of this universe that's so much bigger and greater and richer than ours. And hopefully we too can join that cohort, that fraternity, those who are fortunate enough to immerse themselves in the Almighty's Torah deeper and deeper. It's endless. And we have the great privilege and opportunity to do that. May we be so fortunate to immerse ourselves in the Almighty's Torah and to gain insight and transformation along the way. Of course, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. Nothing delights me more than to hear your questions, your comments, and your feedback.